Is there anything that is misunderstood or underappreciated about China's growing confidence in certain areas or their capacity to have disproportionate influence in certain economic areas over Taiwan?
In terms of on the military side, I think everyone is really clear about the evolving balance of power. China's military capabilities, which have been heavily directed toward preparing for a Taiwan scenario, have increased dramatically. In terms of economic influence over Taiwan, it's an interesting balance. On the one hand, China is 40% of Taiwan's exports, and a lot of the semiconductors that the Taiwanese produce at TSMC and other fabs end up in electronic equipment and other products that are assembled in China and consumed in China or exported elsewhere around the world. There's lots of supply chain linkages. And as China has grown, Taiwan has also grown along with it. And that is still true. Now, the Chinese now are trying to develop their own semiconductor fabrication capacity.
This is The Global Gambit.
So, right now, President Xi Jinping of China is in North Korea, visiting the country for the first time in quite a few years. And such an event, I think, is reflective of a interesting shift that we're seeing by China and Xi's particular approach to foreign policy. He's just hosted, of course, both Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin. And there's a growing idea that perhaps China's changing its soft power and utilizing different approaches to get more influence, including through the economics sphere. And with that in mind, there's someone who I was quite keen to hear from. I'm joined today by Scott Kennedy, who is a senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, an institution in Washington, D.C., and one that we've had quite a few colleagues of Scott's from before. So, Scott, it's delightful to have you on. And in the context of these current developments, shall we say, what do you think China's trying to do? What do you think Xi's objectives are with Korea? North Korea? Is it to improve economic relations or something else?
Sure. Well, it's good to be with you and talk about China and its relations with its neighbors, the U.S. and others. I think what we're seeing is, broadly speaking, China becoming more central to just about every geopolitical issue that's out there and geoeconomic issue. And so Xi Jinping is in North Korea now, but prior to this trip, he had hosted a whole series of leaders who had made the pathway to Beijing, from the leaders of Australia, Great Britain, South Korea, and of course, President Trump, and just behind him, Putin. And China's got growing economic clout, military clout, and everybody is trying to figure out how to either stabilize their relationship with China or manage their relations with China. The one country that's where relations are not improving, and quite the opposite, is with Japan in particular. That's a special case we can come to. With regard to North Korea is China's only treaty ally, and they've had close relations going back many, many decades. However, North Korea presents a real challenge to China because of its closed economy, its very tense relationship with the West, its development of nuclear weapons, and most recently, its collaboration with Russia on the war in Ukraine. The North Koreans actually sending troops to Russia, to the front lines. And so that is a challenge, a new challenge for China. And so I think on the heels of all of these other meetings, Xi Jinping decided to travel to North Korea to take stock of the relationship and see where they might be able to make some progress. I think on a whole range of things. North Korea has not really got a standard economy, so this is not about improving normal trade relations or things like that. It's quite a special relationship that they have.
Yeah, it's very unique. I've always been fascinated by the sort of triangular dynamics between the Russians, Chinese, and North Koreans. But why do you think he's going now then? Is it because he feels it's the right time? He feels he has some leverage? Is it purely sort of self-interested based on the economic opportunities China can leverage in that regard?
Well, I think it's been a long time since he's been. I do think, Kim Jong-un had visited China more recently, back when China had the military parade. But for the moment, Korean Peninsula relations are relatively stable, and you have a president in South Korea who wants to try and find ways to stabilize things even more. And so I think it's just about time for him. There's always the possibility that North Korea is going to do something to get the world's attention. One of the things that's interesting is that while Donald Trump has been president, he's talked about North Korea very, very little. He's not talked about visiting North Korea or meeting their leader anywhere the way he did during the first term. And so I think people are wondering, when is the other shoe going to drop with regard to some potential action by North Korea to get attention. And so this may be just, time for a visit to head off something more problematic or to address what North Korea is doing with regard to its relationship with Russia.
Interesting point there. I'm always fascinated by sort of the North Koreans' effort to remain in the limelight. They have a tenacity kindred, but they seem very relatively nowhere. Very sort of everything else happening in the world. North Korea is very quiet, shall we say. But expanding outwards a little bit here, obviously, to be more with the US-China strategic competition. For a long time, obviously, we've had the tariffs at the forefront of conversations. But after February 28th and Operation Epic Fury, tariffs seem to have fallen by the wayside a little bit, and the imminency or urgency of the impacts of them are not as prominent. Where are we? Since, the past year and a bit since those, Liberation Day or whatever the word was, Trump. Where are we in that? What's the condition of things now?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that tariff man President Trump is willing to consider lowering tariffs in certain instances. In his first term as president, he launched the tariff war against China in the summer of 2018. He imposed something crazy like 10% tariffs, freaked the world out. 10% now. If he did 10% now, people would be like, big deal, right? No, it's nothing. But in that time, 10% seemed like a lot, and the Chinese were really nervous. And so they made a significant number of concessions to get this phase one trade deal that they signed in January of 2020. And, very little retaliation. Were very polite to President Trump throughout. The only time relations got testy in his first term was later in 2020 because of the pandemic. President Trump decided to blame the Chinese for the pandemic. It's true, the pandemic originated in China, but he decided as a political matter, rather than campaign for re-election on the success of the phase one deal, to instead just hammer away at China in 2020. In any case, and then they had a tit for tat in 2020 on a variety of things. During his second term, he decided to go much bolder with tariffs, as you mentioned, the April 2nd, 2025 Liberation Day tariffs against everybody. But Liberation Day turned out to be China's Liberation Day because the tariffs got so high that Chinese decided, heck with it, we're done playing nice, we're done looking to taking the high road, and if you go low, we go low. And so that is what they did. They put restrictions on rare earths and retaliated significantly. The U.S. Got very nervous because of the bond market, and the president basically negotiated a truce with the Chinese over several months so that the Chinese would continue to provide rare earths. And he did so, and he lowered tariffs, not to where they were originally, but a lot lower than the 145% that they hit. And so that's how we got to the beginning of 2026. The war, and then, of course, in February of 2026, the Supreme Court said that his original tariff plan was against the law, and he had to repeal those. So then along in late March, and then around the same time, the U.S. and Israel decide to attack Iran. And having attacked Iran and thinking it would go very easily, and it not going easily, the president finds himself stuck. And so what he does is he consistently underestimates his most important opponents and finds himself needing to look for a plan B or C. And so as a result of not finding an easy path out of the Iran conflict, not being able to overthrow the Iranians, et cetera, he's turned to the Chinese, which is Iran's biggest purchaser of oil, to ask them if they would intervene and try and push the Iranians to make a deal and let up on the Strait of Hormuz. And the Chinese said, this is your fight. You caused the problem. You fix it. And so he got a no there as well. I think the Chinese have been encouraging diplomacy, but they're not using any of their real power to force an outcome. Now, of course, the Chinese need this oil, but they have lots of reserves. Everyone else needs it. And watching the U.S. suffer is not a bad approach.
So,
I think.
Scott,
Let me stop.
No, if I can just interject on that, because it's related to another question I was going to ask you later, but well, I do have one that I'm going to save just a little bit to entice people to keep watching. It's a beater of a question, it's a belter of a question, so you've got to keep watching, audience. But no, simply, how much is China suffering from this war? There's so much speculation. I made a video a couple months back which proved very popular with people because I was arguing that the biggest fear China has is not really necessarily of the economics of it. It's actually over something much different. But how much is Beijing reeling from this, or just a slightly,
not a lot. It's surprising. I mean, China's gets about 8% of its oil from Iran, about 15% from the Persian Gulf, but it has a lot of reserves, and it's been very careful in the use of those. Also, of course, China intervenes heavily in its economy, so when needed, particularly with electricity and fuel, it can use price controls, and so the Chinese government is absorbing most of the pain, as opposed to Chinese consumers and businesses. If you look at the price of energy, electricity in China, it barely has changed. The same, and for gasoline,
Sure.
etc. What's interesting is that even with the biggest other potential effect, the negative effect from this war, is that it creates inflation around the world and suppresses demand for imports, including from China. But the May data for Chinese trade just was released, and Chinese exports were booming in May,
right,
all over the world, to Europe, even to the United States. They were up like 34% year on year, and so they are not feeling the pinch of this war yet. And people think, well, this also reminds folks that maybe depending on internal combustion engine vehicles and other types of fossil fuels may not make sense. And so China's the one with the advantage in green tech. And so I do think the further we go along, you will see problems in China's economy, partly through inflation, but mostly you'll see demand for imports elsewhere dry up. But so far, they're faring much better than just about everybody else.
But what's the time horizon specifically? Or a two-pronged question quickly. What's the time horizon on this? How much reserves do they have? And when do we start seeing them sweat, if at all? But second, and this is more the bigger point of this, which is simply, can we put this notion to bed, Scott, that this war was somehow a part of some grand strategic plan that the Trump administration has, to weaken Venezuela, weaken Iran, and therefore systemically or structurally weaken China as well by extension? Because I've heard people make that argument, and I think personally it's rather preposterous.
Well, I think anything that involves grand strategy is not occurring in Washington, D.C. in our foreign policy. So
right now,
I don't think so. They do have, the Trump administration does have certain general views about the world, right? Might makes right. Power is primarily about hard power, not soft power. You have no permanent allies or enemies, and therefore, and the U.S. has an immense amount of power, and it should be able to throw its weight around pretty well, and everyone should cower in fear of it. I think those are kind of guiding North Stars for the administration, but actually sort of a broader strategy about how to maximize American power in a very complex world. I don't think that there is a clear strategy, even if you look at the national security strategy the administration issued. But those are, they walk into each issue with some general vague notion of what matters. Certainly history doesn't matter because they've certainly not been reading a whole lot of history about what happens when countries get bogged down in the Middle East. And so in the to the other part of your question about, how long is China in a relatively good position? I think in terms of reserves and things, the measure is if they really tap the reserves, it'd be about 3 to 6 months to use them. And I think in a traditional sense good, but I would think it's certainly possible for them to go longer. But because in any case, if the strait is closed for much longer, it's going to hurt China's neighbors, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even Southeast Asian countries, more than the Chinese, because China has other ways to mitigate the damage from this. But I don't think they want this to go on permanently. And I think what they are hoping is what everyone is that eventually the Trump administration declares victory and goes home, and that the world will turn a page to another issue, and trade and oil will flow again through the Strait of Hormuz. That seems to be really the only that outcome that is going to occur. Everything else, I think, is just noise.
So when we look at the current Trump administration's strategy to China, but in the context of obviously Trump's first term, as you mentioned, and then Biden's continuation, this what was it, high rise, high fences, small yard, or small
yard,
strategy.
high fence. That's about technology. But go ahead.
Yes, no, I forgot the term for it. But Trump's obviously continued. The point I'm making is that there's been relatively similar continuation of Trump to Biden back to Trump in China policy and economics, especially than other areas of foreign policy. So, what's that done to China's own standing? Has it accelerated Chinese self-sufficiency, or has it actually helped America in some ways, be them through semiconductor means and such?
Yeah. So I think you're right that in terms of the tools the administrations have been using toward China, there's been a significant amount of continuity. Biden administration kept most of the tariffs on, expanded export controls. The Trump administration has continued to use export controls, although backed off a little bit, but broadly speaking, is still pursuing a strategy of technology denial to China. However, and that may be what's really, at the end of the day, most important, these tools. But in terms of framing and where China fits, we're in a very, very different place now. So the first Trump administration was the U.S. government's last gasp effort to try and integrate China into the global economic system and integrate it. Previous presidents before President Trump had been polite about it and said, we'll use the WTO in negotiations. President Trump said, forget the WTO. We're going to use elbows and tariffs. And that didn't work. The Biden administration, when they came in, they kept a lot of tariffs on, but they said, what we want to do is we want to protect the rules-based order, but we have no confidence that China will ever do anything that they promise. So no negotiations with the Chinese, just small yard, high fence on technology, which became a larger yard and a bigger fence over the 4 years. Extensive collaboration with allies on building that fence, and then interacting with allies through the rules-based order and new components of it, like AUKUS, and no negotiations with the Chinese, not a single one in their 4 years, because they thought it wouldn't result in anything. President Trump in his second term is not about protecting the original rules-based order. He's about obliterating it and eliminating it and replacing it with entirely different order. So no attention to the WTO, Liberation Day tariffs, no, all the principles of no attention to the multilateral order, and on the military side, radically reducing the principles for use of force, etc. And it's in that context that he's been interacting with China, which is very different than what he or Biden were doing in previous administrations, because the Chinese have decided that they are going to push back, and that the president is not trying to defend the rules-based order. He's tried to basically find an exit ramp to continued escalation. And so we saw his visit to Beijing, which was unbelievably conciliatory, and conciliatory in a way that the Chinese loved and were very happy, and reinforced their view that pushing back hard on Trump was successful. The Chinese would never say the words G2, group of two, but they're fine for President Trump to say it or act like China is an equal power. So lots of similar tools in the toolkit, but very different approach, and honestly also a very different outcome, which Beijing is probably quite happy about.
Yeah, no, certainly the summit was remarkable for many things, including what Trump seemingly said in the aftermath of it around Taiwan, and of course his frustrations over the Taiwanese defense bill, and generally sort of what he sees as what perhaps free riding by Taipei. Now, from an economic standpoint, Scott, I'm kind of curious, what does this mean for China's calculus over influencing Taiwan? We've seen patrols, I think, just yesterday or on Sunday up and around the island, with Taiwan, responding in sort of critique. But what does that mean from China's calculus for the economics and trying to pressure Taiwan over semiconductor and sharing of information and all that sort of, just the broader economic warfare, I guess?
Sure. So broadly speaking, the Trump administration has basically taken their foot off China's technology neck. They said, yes, we still got these various technology restrictions, but we are no longer going to complain about Chinese industrial policy writ large. America has done that for decades. We've not gotten anywhere, and we're going to stop. So you're going to have an industrial policy system. We're not going to complain about it whatsoever. Instead, we're going to negotiate for things that we can come to deals on. Beef, Boeings, beans, those were specific things. They said they would find a way to negotiate down tariffs on insignificant products, about $30 billion on each side, through this new board of trade, create a board of investment, perhaps to screen potential new Chinese investment in the United States. With regard to Taiwan, the president, again, this was really a topic the Chinese brought up and made front and center. They're very concerned about, continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, and they were hoping they could get the administration to change declaratory language on Taiwan, which, as a result of U.S. switching diplomatic recognition in 1979, it also at the same time passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which still commits the U.S. to provide for Taiwan's defense. And the U.S. has said that it has this policy of strategic ambiguity. It will likely help Taiwan if China launches an unprovoked attack, but precisely how it would do so is ambiguous, and they won't explain. That's been American policy. And the Chinese wanted the U.S. to adjust its policy on arms sales and change its declaratory policy to more directly oppose efforts by some Taiwanese politicians, including the current president, to pursue independence. And Trump didn't really make any suggestions with regard to the latter. He really didn't change that language. But he did say that essentially he had heard Xi Jinping on weapon sales and he was going to reconsider the sales. And so it basically gives China a say which the U.S. has never given them before. At the same time, as a part of, one issue that has come up is what is at the heart of the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. The way Beijing sees it, it's Washington arms sales and a commitment to Taiwan and Taiwanese efforts to achieve independence. The American view, for the most part, and from Taipei, is that it's China's military buildup, its potential to impose a blockade, its use of gray zone tactics, its intervention behind the scenes in Taiwanese politics, its potential threat to the global semiconductor industry if it launched an attack. And so, but the president didn't bring up any of that. I do think where we end up after this summit, I don't think the U.S. has done anything like give China a green light to attack or increase its threats to Taiwan. And I don't think the Taiwanese come out of this, or the Chinese think, you know what, the U.S. is distracted by Iran, by Ukraine, its stockpiles are low. This is the right time. I still think the Chinese view is the main way that they're going to get what they want unification with Taiwan is simply by waiting everyone else out and hoping that the Taiwanese basically conclude that they can't trust the U.S. to protect them and they have to negotiate with Beijing. That's still the most likely trajectory for right now because all of the other options are way too risky. But nevertheless, it still means people are going to sweat and be worried. And so everyone should be highly vigilant about the Taiwan Strait. But I still think, despite the president's adjustments in tone, that nothing is really radically changed from where we were pre-summit.
Is there anything that is misunderstood or underappreciated about China's growing confidence in certain areas or their capacity to have disproportionate influence in certain economic areas over Taiwan in a way that they didn't used to?
Well, I think, in terms of on the military side, I think everyone is really clear about the evolving balance of power. China's military capabilities, which have been heavily directed toward preparing for a Taiwan scenario, have increased dramatically. The annual spending on its military is quite high, way higher than what its official budget that they report each March says. And the amount of military exercises, et cetera, have increased dramatically. In terms of economic influence over Taiwan, it's an interesting balance. On the one hand, China is 40% of Taiwan's exports, and a lot of the semiconductors that the Taiwanese produce at TSMC and other fabs end up in electronic equipment and other products that are assembled in China and consumed in China or exported elsewhere around the world. There's lots of supply chain linkages. And as China has grown, Taiwan has also grown along with it. At the same time, and that is still true. Now, the Chinese now are trying to develop their own semiconductor fabrication capacity and reduce their dependence on Taiwan dramatically, just like the U.S. wants the Taiwanese to, create more fabs in Arizona and elsewhere. And they're in the process of doing that. Taiwan, though, is still quite important and indispensable to everybody, including the Chinese. I think the other really interesting fact about the Taiwanese strategy is, aware of how dependent they are on China, they have decided that their best strategy on the economic side is to remain as indispensable to China as well. And so they've continued to try and improve their ability to fab at smaller and smaller nodes in ways that nobody else can match. And that's the only economic leverage that they have. And that's something that small powers around the world often try to do, is identify some area of specialization where they can remain extremely important to others. And that's part of Taiwan's economic strategy. It's also part of their national security strategy. But, at the end of the day, Taiwan doesn't have a silicon shield that's going to stop the Chinese from taking action if they decide that they have no other choice.
Interesting. Yeah, no, there's a lot shifting down there on that front. But I guess, what does this do generally if we are to see a prolonged economic confrontation? If things deteriorate again for whatever reason, the war in Iran is wrapped up, the US seems to be just washing its hands of Ukraine, so Trump maybe gets bored and turns his attention to China again, gets frustrated, and so threatens more tariffs or some kind of heightened economic confrontation. Who's in a more resilient position in the short to medium term?
Sure. So, well, I don't know if it's going to be boredom or just a new program that he's got to, that's what generates the president's decision to re-escalate against the Chinese. At the moment, the plan seems to be to keep things calm for the rest of the administration for the next 3 years. That would be a record, maybe, in terms of calmness vis-a-vis any particular other country when Trump is in office. But that seems to be the plan, to focus on other parts of the world, focus on, China does have this leverage on rare earths that the U.S. is not going to find an alternative to China in the next 3 years. There's no reasonable estimate that the U.S. will reduce its dependency significantly enough in the next 3 years that the U.S. could be like, oh, okay, now we can just do whatever tariffs and export controls we want because we don't face any challenges from China where they could counterstrike. Now, of course, the president may decide for whatever reason, whether it's boredom or he realizes the Chinese actually got the upper hand, or he's looking toward, or American domestic politics shift in a way that he has to look tougher. If the Democrats win the midterms in November, or threatening to, and he has to look tougher, or the Chinese do something that he really has to respond to. So I think calmness is the aim, but there are a variety of things that could trigger re-escalation. In that case, my guess is China probably has more shock absorbers than the U.S. They have significant debt. So does the U.S., but China has more fiscal space to spend more money if their economy takes a short-term hit. The U.S., we already have record budget deficits every year, and we're not in a very good place to simply lower interest rates or do other things to provide relief for Americans. We already basically did that. The president basically used all of that last year in his initial tax cuts for folks, and he's had a hard time getting the Fed to lower interest rates when he calls on them to do so. So I think both sides would suffer if there's a significant re-escalation. I think the Chinese would probably be able to get through it a little bit better than the United States.
Now, I've got one and a million other things I could ask you, but I always think short and sweet. So we'll have to have you back, and I know you'd love to because it's been such a great set of questions, right? It's gone.
Absolutely.
No, I'm being facetious, but my penultimate is simply sort of, if China's economy is slowing, as a lot of analysts and people looked, I'm a demographer, I've studied China's demographics, and it's, should we say, tumultuous period in quite a lot of depth. But if China's economy is slowing, why does Beijing appear more geopolitically confident?
Sure. So that is the number one puzzle. China's economy is slowing. The U.S. economy has been growing fast, yet it looks like the Chinese have the upper hand over the U.S. It's really strange. Why is China so confident? The thing is, China is confident because it has made such progress in advanced technologies. In sector after sector, they have made progress, whether it's EVs, robotics, batteries, high-speed rail, and advanced materials, rare earths, in so many different, in all different kinds of machinery, pharmaceuticals, that it's not the Chinese economy of old, and that has come along with them having more higher value exports, investments around the world, not just for assembly. Companies from around the world go to China to innovate. And China's bet, the leadership's bet is, yes, they're spending a ton on tech, but and they know the economy is growing slowly, but they hope that eventually the tech side of the economy gets large enough and efficient enough to balance out against the other parts of the economy that are slowing them down. I'm not sure I think that bet will pay off, but that's their logic. And because all of the headlines every day are about DeepSeek and BYD, Alibaba, Unitree, etc., that gives the Chinese some more courage. It may be liquid courage, but nevertheless, they believe, and others are buying into that. So we will have to see if this bet eventually pays off. If it does, the Chinese will be in a much stronger position than they are today or 10 years ago. If it really slows them down, if all of these shiny things don't translate into more efficient growth, higher productivity, and their economy really drags to a halt as a result of all of those things, then we will see this point as the peak of their power, and in the future they will be less threatening. In many ways, what happened to Japan, right? Japan looks like it was going to blow the world away in the 80s and early 90s, and then real estate bubble, slow growth for decades, right? So China could follow Japan down that path, in which case it wouldn't be the geostrategic worry it is today, or it could do better than Japan, in which case we'd be looking at a 21st century where China's way more central. China, I guess one thing is yes, Chinese think in the long term and have vision, and you can cite something from Lao Tzu or Sun Tzu or something, Confucius, but the Chinese are really very, very good at muddling through in a that gets them through current problems and gets to another level of success, and then that face more problems, and then they retackle those, and they're very good at muddling through. One, because they've got a bunch of super smart people. They've got amazing resources. They have a way, of course, and because they have those resources, they can attract investment and support from around the world. And of course, they're not shy about using sticks and penalizing others. And they're not shy at home when there's domestic protests or other things where people get in the way. It's a very brutal system. And so you've got intense competition at home that drives growth. You've got a party pushing it. You've got a huge, size. And so it can get through lots of problems and push on. Of course, it also has tremendous weaknesses, right? They can, because of the Chinese Communist Party's power and the Xi Jinping's power, he can push on down a road long after it made sense to change direction. And so so their course corrections sometimes take a lot longer before they should start. But in any case, the Chinese have done a pretty amazing job of adapting, of shifting, of muddling through. And we need to, despite the demography and the debt, they're not going anywhere. Even if they had a financial crisis, there'd be a day after a financial crisis. So it'd still be a challenge for the world. So that's what makes, following China so interesting is that their capacity and scale and ability to adapt is really pretty amazing to watch. Real challenging, lots of problematic things, real worrying things about where China's going. And that's from the voices of Chinese I talk to, not me as an outsider. But nevertheless, just headstrong and pushing through China is the uber energizer bunny.
Yeah, certainly. But
I didn't think I was going to come up with that analogy, but
with
yes.
rabbit.